Good morning. How is everyone? Welcome back. Today we are going to talk about what the fancy word for it is, the phenomenology of reading. Okay, phenomenology. What does that really mean? The word phenomena actually comes from Greek, and it means appearance. And therefore phenomenology, logic, science, the study of. So it's the perception or appearance of reading to us. And what it really is about, it is a kind of art and science of the process. Phenomenology reading gets at the process of reading and what we're actually doing as it, in terms of our own perception and cognition as we read. And some of the fundamental things we're going to talk about are meaning and interpretation. On the one hand, what exactly is meaning? It's actually, it's something that at first seems really elusive in some sense, or even really obvious, but we'll break it down in its component parts. You have a word, it refers to something, there's a concept built in there. So meaning. Then interpretation, right? Interpretation is, in the most general sense, it's the process by which we take a text and discern its meaning. And one way to think of interpretation is translating the text into language that you understand, with one important premise in mind. An author says a lot, but what's interesting is very often the most important things they are trying to say or trying to communicate are not said explicitly. The true meaning of a text oftentimes, particularly great works of literature, is given to you, I think you'll know the expression, between the lines, right? The meaning that the author wants to communicate is between the lines. And the only way to discern that meaning is through the process of interpretation. Then we're going to talk about some basic elements of active reading that are really on display, particularly in your reading by Tim Parks, Weapons for Readers. It's this really wonderful and fun little essay about Tim Parks, who is an author, an essayist, but also a teacher, and how he tries to train his students to engage with a text, particularly in a more active way, right? So this whole lecture really has to do with one basic problem that we all are familiar with. Sophisticated readers who read a lot and challenging texts, and the everyday reader, whatever they might be, whether it's a newspaper, whether it's a blog, whether it's a website, what have you, is that we tend to take things at face value, and when we've read them, we assume that simply because we have read and recited what's on the page, that we understand it. Now, in any well-written work, there's much more than what you're getting the first time you read it. And there are certain cues and signposts that indicate that the author is actually saying more than simply what's written. And you say to me, Professor, how can the author say more than what's written, given that everything that they've said is written, right? Well, we'll discover that authors have a way of communicating between the lines in which you are forced to make an inference. It's a really important concept, and it is at the heart, it is at the essence of interpretation. To make an inference is to take the information that's there and realize that there is a logic, there is a sequence, such that from what is there, you can deduce a new fact that isn't explicitly stated, but is effectively being said by the author. And we'll look at specific examples to make that perfectly clear, right? So students were always asked, and there is a kind of fundamental bias of students in general, I find, that interpretation, meaning, it's a literature class, these are works of art, it's all subjective. It's whatever we bring to it. It's all poetry, right? I'm me, and when I come to it, I see this, and when you come to it, I see that, and there's no objective standard to adjudicate those two different points of view. On one hand, I want to say it is absolutely, I don't use the word essential. It's it is significant and must be taken under consideration that people reach different conclusions in reading the same text, right? It's like you see a crime scene, you see a crime happen, and two people have two different opinions about what really, two witnesses have different opinions about what really happened. And the one thing we're going to say is we're going to explain why that is. And there's some very specific, really objective reasons why that happens, number one. Number two, I do want to make an argument that good writers have a high level of control over their meaning, which is that they've spent a lot of time crafting writings, essays, books, novels, poetry, and that they have a lot of control out of the implications that are going to be drawn from it. Much the way a comedian, when they tell a joke, they know when they tell it whether they're going to get a laugh. Either, they have the timing right, they've tried this joke out before, they already know the audience is predisposed to the joke, any number of factors involved. Authors absolutely have very clear objective meanings that are not publicly stated in their text that they're trying to communicate to you, right? And there is a point at which certain interpretations are absolutely just correct and other interpretations are just not correct. And it all comes down to two things. Number one, the evidence from the text. And number two, the inferences you draw from the text. Meaning, and by inference, a conclusion you've drawn from the text that's based on the logic of the text, but it is not explicitly stated in the text, right? Last thing. Why is this important? I know how to read, Professor. I've been doing it since I was 4 years old, and so on and so forth. We are reading the kind of works that are really designed to be mulled over and churned over in one's mind and read over and over for a lifetime, right? I give the example of the person on the subway who's got their dog-eared Bible, and they've been reading those same parables and those same stories over and over and over again, because every time they're reading it, they're discovering a new meaning. And that's partly for two reasons. One, their own life experience is growing as they read those stories. At the beginning, when they get them as a child, they're just, I need to know the story of thus and so. But then at 20, it means this. And then at 50, it means this. And then, at 70, it means something different when you've really gone through a significant amount of experience. Because authors are often talking about experiences that you're not fully conversant with. The other thing is authors who are really exceptional authors have control over the meaning, and they normally have multiple meanings. They have multiple meanings in the text. Furthermore, a great work of literature, yes, there are certain core meanings that you need to draw to understand like the playing field of what's being said. But there is certainly a point in a text where an author will, and I think Shakespeare is a tremendous example of this, and I'll give a specific example in a second, where the author purposely leaves a kind of opening for different interpretations, not by accident, not by subjectivity, because you're you and this other person is them, but because they have an intention to leave it open and for us to compel us, the reader or the viewer of the play, to contemplate it, right? And of course, the beauty of that approach to writing is that it's reflective of our own experiences and the elusiveness of the clear meaning of our own life and our relationships and so on and so forth. And I'll give you the really great example coming out of Othello is, you tell me what is the motive of Iago, the main character, the protagonist, alongside Othello, the other main character. What is his motive in bringing about Othello's downfall? And what's so fascinating about it is that there are a handful of moments where Iago explicitly states why he's doing what he's doing to Othello. And yet, when you get to the end of the play, you have yourself scratching your head as to why exactly he did this, because his explanations, they don't seem to add up. They don't seem to be the whole story. And it seems that Shakespeare has intentionally crafted particularly Iago's motive to come across that way. If you think for a second of a film that you really love, you tell me why you've watched it 20 times, right? What is a great work of literature? It's a work of literature like that film you've seen 20 times, that every time you come back to it, you discover something new. Because the first time you read it, you were just getting familiar with like the basic facts. And this is what I'm going to stress through the entire semester, that literature, the facts are the necessary gateway into the meaning of the text. You must know the facts. You need to know that, I don't know, the character is 40 years old, and I'm thinking Odysseus here, and he's been away from home for 20 years, and he's never actually seen his son, who's about 20, slightly over 20 years old, and he's been away from his wife for 20 years. You need to have all those facts to start then entering into other meanings. But that the text, the real value is not just the facts, ma'am. It is the meaning that starts to emerge from those facts when we start to consider the implications they have for this man's life, for his character, for what kind of human being he is, and so on and so forth. Right? So I'm going to demand of you a type of reading that's going to be a little unusual. And I know everyone in class is going to be at a different place in their skills of reading. I have non-native speakers and so on. And so we're going to talk about these skills. And then what we're going to do is read about them in the readings on readings, because those readings deal with some of these skills. But then we're going to apply the skills. On one hand, we're going to apply these skills throughout the totality of the course. But more specifically, next week, what we're going to do is look at some very, very short writings. Likely Mending Wall, and an essay or a short story called Girl by Jamaica Kincaid. And what's lovely about having a really short, in one case is a poem, Mending Wall, in the other case it's a short story, is that by being so short, we can really see them in their totality and really go deep into them. And the first couple readings we're going to have, once we get to Genesis, actually I'm going to be asking you to read pretty small portions. It's not going to be that much. And the load of the reading will be more and more. I've asked you to read a lot with the readings on reading. But by giving you a very small amount, we're going to try to look into and delve into, pry under the surface, if you will, to get to some of the potential meanings in these texts, right? You can't read the Bible every day. Sometimes you got to read some, you've got to read some junk food for your brain. Everybody knows that. Even professors read junk food for their brain and watch junk food on television, right, for their brain. But what's great about the Bible as an example of literature is that it is the essence of a book that just cries out to be read and reread and reread and reread, right? Nabokov, he wrote Lolita, Russian who came to America, an American immigrant. He famously said that all reading is rereading, because the first time you didn't get the whole picture. And we're going to talk about something called the hermeneutic circle. And the idea is, until you get the totality of the picture, that you really don't have any of the meaning, right? Until you see how everything fits together. So you could take, for an example, this idea of the hermeneutic circle, which we'll talk about later. What is the meaning of my life, right? Which at first sounds like an absurdly broad question, and this kind of saccharine, sentimental, I'm seeking meaning in my life, right? On one hand, the meaning of your life is obvious. You wake up in the morning, you brush your teeth, you go to work, you go to school, etc., etc. You have relationships that entail obligations and duties and pleasures and so on and so forth, right? But the meaning of your life can't really be fully grasped until you've reached the end of it. And just like the end of a story, when you're at the end of a story, you've now seen the whole thing, right? And then the meaning can find its place, because if you don't understand how all the parts relate, whether it's the story or of your life, how those parts relate together, you really can't grasp the meaning. And meaning has a lot to do with kind of structural relationships and references and the like. Okay. Why is interpretation so important? Particularly for the text we are going to read, the meaning of the text will not hit you over the head. You will read, and you will think you've gotten the meaning, and you will have received the kind of superficial understanding of what's being said, but you won't fully understand what is meant. And these works, they really demand a sense of active. I don't want to use the word struggle. I don't want to use the word it's painful, but they demand a type of focus that, particularly in our world, is a challenging demand. The world of the internet, the world of the phone, these blinking devices just capture your attention. I've got a 6-year-old daughter. I see it every day. So we need to learn how to interpret, because the meaning of the text is not self-evident, which means not going to hit you over the head. The other reason is a psychological factor that comes with the first one. And that is, we're arrogant about what we think we know, what we think we read, what we think we see, or what we think we hear. We assume we grasp everything when we take it in that first instance. And the reality is we don't. And what I'm asking of you is to become aware and to accept the principle that I know that I don't know something, and to be comfortable with that idea, kind of knowledge of one's own ignorance. And, we don't like admitting we're ignorant. We are by nature arrogant in a subtle way, because we want to show people that we know what's going on and that we've got our stuff together. And that has like social implications, right? Like, we've got to show people that we're competent, right? And what I'm saying here is, one of the best questions you can say to yourself is, what does this mean when you read it? You say to yourself, I have no clue what this means, right? That is actually a very important reaction to a text. It actually means you're reading carefully to recognize that you don't fully grasp what's going on. And you've all seen those movies. The first time you see it, or you see a scene, or Quentin Tarantino, where he rearranges the narrative structure, and you go, why is this happening right now? And then at the end of the film, you go, oh, that's why it's happening, right? Okay, so therefore, the solution to this problem of ignorance and arrogance is to be Socratic, to know that you don't know. Knowledge of one's own ignorance is the first step toward knowledge. If you're ignorant, but you think you know when you actually don't, you are not going to pursue your understanding, right? Socrates, the famous Greek philosopher, right, in the high classical period of ancient Greece, 5th century BC, he said, the only thing that I know is that I do not know. And of course the question comes up, does he really know anything when he says this? Well, the answer is obviously yes, because there's some people who think they know when they don't, right? So when you say, I know that I don't know, you're cognizant of the fact that you're lacking of certain facts, right? So knowledge of our own ignorance is an absolutely crucial bit of information. And we talked about science in our previous video. The whole endeavor of science, and particularly modern science, is predicated on the notion that we don't know everything about the world, and therefore that actually compels us to go out and seek knowledge through experiments, through research, to figure out what really is happening in the world, right? Think about the world before microscopes or before telescopes, right? I mean, we could hypothesize about tiny particles that we couldn't see with our eyes, like atoms, which was actually hypothesized way back in, I think, the 6th century BC by Democritus, right? But we were effectively ignorant about all those things that we couldn't see with our eye, and we discovered that there's a whole world, almost a whole universe of things that are smaller than our eye can see. I'll give you one more example by ignorance. Awareness of one's own ignorance is so important. There's a book called Sapiens, and it's about the development of civilization and basically us becoming modern beings with a modern world with all the technology and culture and sophistication we have today. Both the positive and negative aspects of it. But he talks about the period of navigation that the Europeans engaged in the 15th and 16th centuries that, of course, led not just to the discovery of the New World, but the conquest of the New World and the mapping out of the whole globe for the first time in history, right? The Chinese, and part of that was predicated on having the ships that could actually travel across things like the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean and around the Horn of Africa and the Cape of Good Hope in South America. And apparently the Chinese had ships that were seaworthy to take these kind of journeys, but they didn't fully grasp the potential of how these ships could be used, right? It was kind of like a lark. It was kind of just like, should I say, shits and giggles. We've got this great ship. We can go out on the ocean. We come back, and that's that. Why? Because they felt at that time they had a full understanding of all the geography that was in the world. There was nothing to discover for the Chinese at the time. Very sophisticated civilization. Nonetheless, they weren't aware of their own ignorance. They weren't aware of the New World, and so on and so forth. Whereas, with almost the same exact technology, the Europeans, for whatever reason, had this hunch of awareness of their own ignorance, which is actually one of the central tenets of Western civilization. You can hear a lot of criticisms about Western civilization from a variety of sources these days, and a lot of them within the university. But one of the most powerful ideas in the Western tradition, so-called tradition, which is handing down that dogma from one generation to the next, one of the fundamental traditions is actually a belief that there is always something new to learn about, that we don't know. There is always a new horizon to span, to discover. And what really allowed us to discover the New World, and yes, I know that, various peoples had been on the Americas for a long time, and ships had probably come there, obviously. And actually, that doesn't mitigate Columbus's trip. But the point is, it wasn't their technology that was the difference. It was their cognitive approach, that there was something to discover. There was a new world to discover. And what am I saying about these texts? That there is a world in there to be discovered when one applies oneself. So do you know something when you have knowledge of your own ignorance? The answer is absolutely, and it's a very crucial fact. Okay, so what's the challenge with interpretation? We ask ourselves, why doesn't the meaning of the text hit us over the head? That is because there is a gap between the words on the page and the meaning or thought behind them, right? Because fictions, so we're reading myth, poetry, fiction, right? Coming out of the ancient world. And they are determined to show you, this is really crucial distinction, one that Henry James, the 19th century American/British writer, made. The difference between showing, an author showing you something and telling you. What is telling? Telling is, I explain the mystery of the universe away to you. This is what it is. It's matter in motion. I'm telling you exactly what it is, right? In a logos, in an explanatory way. But to show you, when authors show you, they write stories to explain things. And instead of explaining them to you, they depict what they're trying to talk about. And then you have to kind of reverse engineer to figure out what is the message, what is the moral that they're trying to communicate to you. There's a famous line by Hitchcock. He says, the worst movie is the one in which two characters stand around explaining the plot. So what they're doing, the characters, instead of having like a normal lifelike conversation, are explaining the key plot elements so you can follow what's going on in the story, as opposed to the director and the writer of the film having the savvy to just show you the plot and for you to figure out what's going on, right? Anything about a good film, just like a good book, Hitchcock wanted to compel you to figure out what's going on. And if you watch a good Hitchcock film, and most of them are good, I would say, there is always some major element of the film that you're purposely left in the dark about, and you're to connect the dots. You have to make that inference, that interpretation, and he doesn't hand it to you on a platter, right? This is coupled with, I would say that, and this is another discussion, but in the ancient world, there was an appreciation of metaphorical and figurative speech. Their very approach to writing was in a kind of code, right? It was esoteric, meaning that, I don't want to use the word occult, but I think the word occult means hidden, right? The meaning that they really wanted to communicate was hidden from you. And it took a reader to kind of unpack and decipher the meaning. And the meaning was entered into through the surface, but it was above and beyond just the surface, right? So we'll look at an example in a moment where the gap between words that an author says and what they actually mean, or the thought behind them, is clear, right? So when we talk about irony. Okay. So what are some of the problems in understanding the meaning of a word? Even on the most basic level of what a word is, there are problems of meaning. Now, if meanings were that elusive, we would not be able to communicate with one another at all. A book would not make sense to you. It wouldn't mean anything. So we have to have common symbols with common meanings that we all can grasp in order for us to be able to communicate. But as I said in the last video, all forms of communication are also miscommunication. That's because there is a domain or a segment of what we've heard or read that we do grasp, but then there's also a segment we don't, and we're going to explain why that is. So first of all, a word is just a symbol, right? So here's one of the basic problems. A word is a symbol, and it refers to a thing, but it is not the thing itself. It is like the thing, right? An image of Jesus is not Jesus. And if you mistakenly took that image for Jesus, you would not be understanding properly the relationship between the symbol and the thing, right? If you know the story of Don Quixote, he's a guy who was like a small nobility, had a little plot of land, he wasn't terribly wealthy, he loved to read books, he read chivalric novels, and he read so many that one day after reading for days on end, he walked outside and he thought he was a chivalric knight in the Middle Ages, and meanwhile, he was a 17th century Spaniard in a world that was very different from the fantasy hero world of the chivalric novel. So he didn't understand the relationship between the words on the page and the world outside, that they were imaginary. So a symbol is both like the thing and it's not the thing. The best example is an image, a painting or a photograph. In certain ways it looks like it, but it's not the thing, and we wouldn't confuse the two, right? Since a symbol is not the thing itself, it both reveals and conceals the thing. So let's be clear. When we use words, which are symbols, and they are symbols of exchange, I want to talk about something, so I give you my symbol to understand. My word makes reference to some experience I've had. Like, I don't know, I had a good day, right? If I tell you I had a good day, how do you understand that? Well, it wasn't a bad day, but what kind of day was it exactly? What is a good day for me? What do I think of as a good day? A good day for me may be a bad day for you because you have different likes, you have different experiences, and so on and so forth. So even little things like this open up kind of vast vistas of potential ambiguity, right? So therefore we have to learn to translate and interpret these symbols, because our experiences and the words we use to capture them are not the same. Okay, so another reason why there's a gap between the word and their meanings, because there's a distinction between the lexical meaning of a word and the contextual meaning of a word. These are really important distinctions, and it's a lot of kind of fancy words here, but it means simple things. The lexical meaning of the word is simply the literary dictionary or textbook meaning of a word, right? We all know the contextual meaning of a word, understanding a word through its use and context, right? Which is to say, I've used a word a certain way that isn't the way that the dictionary would strictly use it, and therefore, by using it in a slightly different way, I've actually given it a slightly different meaning, right? And if you opened up to the dictionary would not give you that subtle coloring of meaning that, say, John Donne used in a poem in the 17th century, right? Because the dictionary can only deal with the one most public, most common understanding of the word. And we'll talk about a basic way of understanding how words work, an expression from Ludwig Wittgenstein, philosopher of language, who says this: meaning is use. Meaning is use. And when he says use, he's talking about meaning is the contextual meaning. Contextual meaning has to do with how I use the word in a specific context or in a specific instance, right? So, just to give you an example, if I picked up this bottle and said, for the duration of our course today, when I refer to this, I'm not going to call it bottle, I'm going to call it an X. And for the sake of argument, I'm just going to say, whenever I say X, this is actually what I'm talking about, right? So then, halfway through the class, someone comes in and they haven't been given that explanation, and I start talking about an X and drinking from an X, and the person is scratching their head thinking I'm totally crazy, right? As opposed to just a little bit crazy. And that's because they don't have the relevant context, right? A really great example of this is irony. Now, irony has lots of shades of meaning. What is irony, right? That's a whole question in itself. But the strictest and most original meaning of the word irony, it comes from the Greek, is literally a statement that means the opposite of what is actually said, such that the lexical meaning and the contextual meaning are directly contrary to one another. And there are a lot of ways in which it's indicated that they're actually contrary. It could be their contextual use, or it could be tone of voice, or the circumstances, so on and so forth, right? So I had a friend I worked with who was born and raised in Brooklyn, a grumpy curmudgeon of a guy who was fun to work with, but also difficult because he was such a curmudgeon. But he lived out on the West Coast for a while in California, and he said one of the problems with people from California, because we're all in New York here, so we can talk about people from California, right? He said they don't get irony. And he says, yeah, I came into work one day, and it was pouring down rain, and he goes, yeah, what a lovely frickin' day, right? And the guy from California said, yeah, man, it is really wonderful. You know, the California, like all kind of light and fluffy, right? They're always in a good mood for something. And New Yorkers they're not always in a bad mood, but they're a little crazy, right? If you want the bad mood, you go to Boston. That's where the bad mood is. But so the point is, when he says, yeah, it's a really lovely day and it's pouring down rain, what he actually means is a really crappy day, right? And you know that from the context and because you know your friend a little bit and this is the kind of thing he says. And the important thing is that the literal meaning or the lexical meaning is directly opposite the contextual meaning. So you can see immediately the challenge and the interest of language. I mean, here we've taken a statement and we can make it mean exactly opposite what it actually means. And another great example is Michael Jackson's, the song Bad, right? Bad actually means good, or it means like really freaking cool or something like that, really hip, right? But that's bad, right? Of course, that's not, we're not in the 1980s anymore, but that still has use. And, the interesting thing here is, how did anybody know that when Michael Jackson said that's bad, people go, oh yeah, that's really cool. That means it's really cool. Well, the reality is because there were probably, I mean, first of all, where did Michael Jackson get bad? He probably didn't make it up himself. I guarantee you, if you had some like ethnologist go look into the history and talk to people, they discover that like bad as something being cool or good had some currency, you know, in the African American milieu of the 1980s. It caught on in maybe certain cities or some such, and then he popularizes it, and then everybody knows about it, and then takes that meaning for granted, even though it means exactly the opposite of the dictionary meaning of the word. We still addressing here? We're addressing why we need to interpret and why we need to think about it, and I'm doing that by showing you all the problematic relations between words and their meanings, or statements and their meanings, or books and their meanings, right? And there's a series of gaps. There's a gap between the world and words, right? I can use any sound to refer to any object, and you notice then that that's completely arbitrary. Language is like, in sense, they're variables that have fixed meanings, like x equals 2 and y equals 3, but if you set someone up for the fact that you're going to alter the meaning of those words, and maybe just subtly, you can change the values of x and y to something else. And here's the interesting thing. There is no necessity between the words we use and the things we're talking about in the world, right? Which is to say, we need only look at all the different languages on the planet. How many different words are there for cat? How many different words are there for dog? What is the essential word that really captures the essence of the dog, right? And I'll make this clear. In the beginning, God creates everything in Genesis 1, and then he creates Adam. And what does Adam get to do? He gets to name all the animals, and he's speaking in some kind of language that God has invented. And at this time, it seems that the name for the animal and the animal itself are one and the same. That in fact the verbal expression of the name is actually the thing itself, right? And there's no distinction, and there's only one name for the thing, and they kind of are two facets of the essence of the thing. Now, is that real life? No. So then you fast forward to the Tower of Babel, and what happens? People's tongues get twisted. They can't communicate with one another. And they now and they're all speaking different languages. The Tower of Babel's story is an explanation of how all the different languages on the earth came to be. And the point is they can't communicate with each other, and there is no longer this kind of original divine language that has a perfect harmony with what it talks about. It doesn't merely describe it, it is it. So there's a gap between an author's experience and our own, right? So Homer is, and the Greeks who crafted that story, lived starting almost 3,000 years ago, and their lives, of course, obviously, in many ways very different. Their whole expectations about life, their system of values different, their political structure different, their technology different, their religion is different, and on and on. So they are going to embed in their language a different set of experiences, even though they're maybe using words that are pretty translatable from one to one without, a whole lot. But when they use the word, I don't know, politics, it means something specific to the politics of their life, and it's different from ours. And therefore they use their words in a different way. There's a gap between what is said and what is meant, or the thought behind the words. That's something we just talked about. Other types of gaps. There's a gap between the words and action of a person, between and the reality behind them, right? So this gets into a function not just of text, but the way human beings are. One of the most fascinating aspects of human beings is that we can lie. one of the most fascinating aspects of human beings is that we can represent ourselves to the world on Facebook, in speech, in class, in one way, and yet harbor things that have not been revealed. We can conceal things, we can change things, right? And even when we're not trying to be hypocritical or deceptive, we naturally do not reveal everything that's on our mind for all kinds of very reasonable reasons. So it's just a fascinating thing about human beings. And of course, we're going to see this with Iago. He's kind of fundamentally an elusive character. And you'll see that he will put up a kind of mask of language and body gesture with every person he interacts with, deceiving them. There's a gap between what is said and what is not said, right? Omission, I can leave things out that are important. And there's a gap between what is said and the truth, which is lying by commission. I can actually misrepresent something. So we're going to see Iago just be a flat-out lie, things like that. Then this ties into author's experience. There's the shifting context of words. And one of the great examples that we'll look at is actually the Constitution, right? There's a huge... The issues that we're talking about of interpretation here are not just academic. They are absolutely crucial to our everyday lives, because there is a whole movement of constitutional scholarship today being used by judges, lawyers who are academics, Supreme Court justices, who say that the meanings of the words of the Constitution literally evolve over time as time changes, as history changes. And then there are others who say, of course not. When James Madison said X, he meant X, and if we want something else, well, we can't pretend that he was saying something different. We just have to amend the Constitution or pass a new law. So this issue of this problem of interpretation has very real world consequences. Okay. So to get into this relationship of names and the relationship with the world, we've already established, or talked about some of these things already. We've already established that words do not have a fixed relationship to the world, and therefore I can use any word to talk about anything. Now the key thing is the other person at some point has to understand it. So think about Michael Jackson's "I'm Bad," right? He used it at a time when that usage was popular enough for it to stick, right? And the language was actually changed. I mean, this raises a whole other issue that dictionary, if you look in a dictionary, very often it has etymology of the word. And what's the first thing you notice? The meaning of the word has changed over time, right? The meaning of the word has changed over time. Why? Because as society changes, they start using the words in different ways, not to be apply in fundamentally different ways, but to the meaning just kind of shades in a certain direction. Of course, there's some really interesting words that have actually come to mean the opposite of what they originally meant. So here, the Bible clarifies this issue. So in the beginning of the Gospel of John, it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God," right? That means the Word is God incarnate. That means the Word of God and God are one and the same. But of course we know that's divine language. That's special God's language. Human language doesn't work like that. The Word and the thing are two separate things, and the one connects cognitively with the other, but the connection's not permanent. So there's some really crazy stuff as a result of that in Genesis. So, in the beginning, God creates stuff, and he's, among other things, he says, "And God said, let there be light, and there was light." Right? Think about that for a second. He didn't make light with his hands. He didn't turn on the cosmic sun. He created light by speaking it into existence. And the invocation or the incantation of the word creates light. And the Bible, you can see, it's actually very sophisticated, is trying to show us the way in which this divine speech of God is tethered to the being of things, or the essence of things, or the reality or the existence of things, and that they're one and the same thing. They don't simply describe the world, they are the world, right? And of course, that doesn't work with human language. So therefore, there's a harmony between the world and the word that doesn't exist in real life, because as any interpreter of the Bible would tell us, we live after the fall. We live in a condition of fallenness in which there is not harmony, but disharmony. So the Tower of Babel we talked about, which is to say there was this harmony of the words between the world, and the Tower of Babel comes along. They try to build this tower up, and God says, no, 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 you're not going to build a tower to the heavens and become God yourself. And one of the ways he stymies them is to twist their tongues, which makes them not be able to speak the same languages, and they're unintelligent. When they speak, they're unintelligible to one another, and they can no longer coordinate to build this structure. And it is a kind of origin myth to explain the origins of all the different languages in the world, right? People who form groups with one another, but they can't, in groups, but then those groups can't communicate with other groups, or at least not nearly as well. And of course, we talked about the people of the book and the way a book brings unity. Obviously, language is one of the language groups, and language is one of the most powerful things that bring people together in community. And community, as we said, is a group of people who are brought together, and they're not just physically in the same space, time and space, but they're brought together by serious common things that their identity is rooted in, like language, like religion, like values that they're willing to die for, right? Think about how many values there are willing to die for in life. There's only a very small number, I would say. So this raises an interesting question. Is language referential, or is it creative? Now, we talked about that with stories in our previous video. Are stories, do they represent the world, or referential, or do they create a world, right? And there's some interesting ambiguities here. And we should say for now that language doesn't simply refer to the world, it also creates the world. Language can be used in a variety of different ways that's not simply referential, and it also produces concepts that don't seem to have any tangible existence in the world. Like, what is a spirit, or what is God? Depending on how you think about it, God is a word that creates a reality that without the language doesn't have an existence. That's, of course, a scientific or almost atheistic perspective on it. But language, if you think of poetry, you think of creativity in poetry, it has the power to produce images and ideas that don't exist prior to their being created. Okay, what does a word actually consist of? We're going to analyze a word, meaning we're going to break it down into its component parts. So, what is in a name? A name consists of a symbol, right? And it's either a sound or an image. So I have cat in quotation or scare quotes here for a reason, because we're not referring to that fuzzy thing that you know and love, or maybe you don't because you'd rather have a dog, but we're literally referring to CAT, the symbol for the furry thing, and it's either spoken or written. And obviously you quickly see the difference between the symbol and the reality of the cat that it's trying to capture. The next thing is the referent, and the referent is the literal thing you claim to be or are trying to speak about in your speech, right? An interesting word is I, right? When I say, let's say we're all in the class and having a conversation, and I say I. Me, my body, Professor Smith, myself, is the referent of the word I. But the moment you use the word I, you actually mean something different about it, by it. You mean you. Not to confuse things here, but you see the complication, right? So if we're talking about the referent for CAT, the referent is that furry creature who, some of you might have in your home right now, right? Language, the fundamental goal of language is communication, right? And the fundamental goal of communication is to disseminate information to other people to our advantage, whether it's coordinating action or just telling someone a pleasurable story, right? So The referent is the information we're really trying to communicate, right? So there has to be a fair amount of objective understanding of, we're going to use this symbol for this referent. But of course, they're not absolutely fixed, and we'll see why. Then there's a concept of a cat. I'll ask you right now, is your concept of a cat the same as mine? Right? So the cat is the concept under which all the referents are subsumed. Right? So the concept is like a category under which, let's say you've seen 100 cats in your life. For some reason, you all call them cats. And you don't call one of them a dog or a camel. That's because you've subsumed them, or you brought them under cognitively this category of a concept that unites a disparate group. Because the first thing you realize is, well, those cats don't all look exactly the same. And at what point do you get to the border where one actually, is that a cat or is that something else? I don't know. Right? So are our concepts the same? The answer is they're not perfectly the same, because our concepts are made from what? They're made from our experience. Where does our experience come from? I don't know, our definition of the word from the dictionary that we all hold pretty much very similar, but then we have different experiences. I mean, imagine if I'm 5 years old and I've only seen one type of cat my whole life. It's only 5 years old. And then I see one that looks really different, and technically scientists call it a cat. But to you, it just doesn't look like a cat, so you don't call it a cat, right? So think about more elusive words than cat, like love. Here's a great word, or like, what's the boundary between love and friendship, right? Rousseau, famous philosopher and writer from 18th century France, he writes his autobiography, and he talks about a relationship he has with a woman. And he says, it's somewhere between love and friendship. The only problem is there isn't a word to describe exactly our relationship, because it's not exactly love and it's not exactly friendship either. It's like a third thing that there simply isn't a word for, right? And so what is the goal of great poets? To give voice to those elusive, in some cases, those elusive experiences that are hard to name, and try to capture them with the language that we already have at our disposal, right? So the relationship between 1, 2, and 3 is all arbitrary. They can be changed. Obviously, if you really change them a lot, you're not going to be understood by someone else. So you can only change it so much to still be understood. Or you have to give someone a cue, like I'm going to say, now this referent is going to be referred to by the symbol X, and everybody knows what I'm talking about now. Right? So meaning is really determined and established by social consensus. We all agreed to accept that CAT means this. This is the concept. This is a referent that falls under the concept. But the problem is our different experiences and our different educational experiences, our different backgrounds, are going to lead us to different points of view. Take, for example, some type of technical textbook. I don't know, an economics textbook or a neuropsychology textbook. I don't know what it is. And it has all types of technical usages of certain words, right? And you've probably even heard a lot of these words before used in other contexts. But when they're used in the context of that discipline, all of a sudden they mean something very specific that your other experiences outside that discipline have not prepared you for. Like, economics. Marginal utility. Marginal utility. I know what it means, marginal. I know what utility is. But when you put them together and you put them in an economics book, I have no clue. Right? So here we get a kind of example, right, in which we've got our cat. And we've kind of talked about this already. But you see these three images here, in many ways, just to make a point on it, they actually in many ways look very similar. If you put a bear next to them, a face of a bear, or the face of, chimpanzee, these three would look very similar. And the thing on the far left actually, I guess, is like a chihuahua or something. Or maybe it's just a different type of cat. Honestly, I can't tell whether it's supposed to be like a hairless Egyptian cat or whether it's supposed to be a chihuahua. So you can start to see some of the problems. One has to become aware that maybe all three of these images come under the concept of cat, and therefore that's the word to use. So this is all brought about by this fundamental ambiguity between our experiences of the world that come through first our senses and then our cognition of them, and then our attempt to encapsulate our experiences in words and communicate them to another person, right? So there's what's that great film, Lost in Translation? I can't even remember, honestly, why that movie is called Lost in Translation, other than they're in a foreign country for an American and they don't understand what people are saying in Japan. But the point is, there's a tenuous relationship between our words and the world, and that's why we've got this mathematics. This is an equivalency, like a rough equivalency. It's not perfectly equal, right? So therefore, there are problems of communication, which do what? They necessitate careful interpretation. They necessitate that we don't just assume we know what someone is talking about. And when it comes to boys and girls in relationships, that comes to the fore. I mean, have you ever had a really serious relationship discussion where someone was telling you something really important, like they're upset and they have to explain why, and they need you to understand, right? And they say it. And you sit there wanting, with great empathy and great sympathy and compassion, to understand what they're saying. And you're sitting there saying, I don't actually understand at all what they are telling me, right? And it's not because you're dumb. It's because they're coming from a different point of view, right? Mars and Venus, as it were. Okay. So because interpretation is a challenge, because there's a gap between words and meaning, and that the text, meaning the text won't hit you over the head, we need the art of interpretation. What is that art? It is the process of moving from the surface of the text to the thoughts behind it, or from the words to the heart and mind of the author. We need to read between the lines. What is between the lines? Literally. Let's be literal. There's nothing between the lines, right? But the point is, there is something between the lines. It's the words that the author hasn't explicitly stated, right? And we'll look at this more in a moment. You have to make interpretation is the process of putting something in your own words. It's the process of making inferences from the text. It's the process of translating the text into a language that you understand. So you need to read between the lines. It's the process of making inferences. It's a really important concept. An inference is a conclusion reached on the basis of evidence, which is, the text is the evidence, right? And reasoning. But it's a conclusion, bottom here, it's a conclusion that goes beyond the evidence, that's not explicitly stated. Now, inferences are a form of reasoning. They're making deductions from the evidence presented in a given situation. If you think about what a crime scene investigator does, they take, the candlestick over there and the splatter of blood over here and so on and so forth. And then they deduce or infer what they think may have happened, right, to produce the facts that they have, right? So inferences in some cases are really pretty ironclad, right? So for example, let's take this, a number series. This is kind of just really straightforward. Now, this is so simple, you know that the question mark must be for, you know, right? Do you know? Well, I suppose this series could change its logic by the time it gets to that fourth space, but that wouldn't seem very rational or effective. So how do you know that it's for? It's not just, at first it's like you've seen this series so many times. It's just boom, it's for, you don't think about it. But the more important thing is, you know how a number series work. It has to do with the relationship of one number to the next. So you establish that the ongoing relationship is between them +1, and then it's plus 1, so it must be 4, right? And number series can be much more sophisticated than this. I only give this obvious one to really drive the point home. Oh, sorry there. So here is a joke in which, this is really great, the punchline of the joke is delivered through an inference being made by the listener. And what's more devastating is that the joke is on the listener, and they are the ones to make the inference to effectively tell themselves the joke, rather than Winston Churchill telling it to this lady. So there is a story, and it may be apocryphal, and I've never really seen definitive proof that it's a true story. But Winston Churchill, the leader of the free world, the leader of Great Britain during World War II, who valiantly led them the blood, sweat, and tears speech to help conquer the Nazis and save Europe and a lot of the earth from the tyranny of the Nazis. He was famous for being a drinker, and if you watch the movie that came out a year and a half, 2 years ago, with Gary Oldman, you'll see him drinking a lot and so on and so forth. And apparently he was at some kind of public gathering, and he was a bit soused, a bit fractured. He was a little bit in the bag. He was trashed, right? And a woman comes up to him, offended that the leader of the free world, the leader of Great Britain, would be drunk in public. It's just not appropriate, right? And she goes, "Mr. Churchill, you are drunk." And of course, what she's saying is, "I'm offended." What is she really saying? I mean, she's making an obvious observation, right? One of the interesting things to take away with what she's really saying is, "I'm offended that you're drunk." And he says, "Yes, madame, but you are ugly, and in the morning I will be sober." Right? So what is he saying here? Right? What is he really saying is the point. And what he's really saying is only arrived at through inference. So I'm so used to telling this joke in class and like having an audience and have half the class immediately get it and half the class not get it. But of course what he's saying is that in the morning he's going to be sober, but she will still be, as they say in Great Britain, less than attractive. Right? And the point is, he hasn't explicitly said that, but that's clearly what he means. And the inference to be drawn is based on a kind of ironclad logic, right? I am drunk. My drunkenness will go away in the morning. You are ugly. It's cruel. Politically incorrect, I should say. You are ugly, and that won't change in the morning, right? And of course, who is making the inference? This poor woman who is being insulted by the leader of the free world. But the important thing to recognize here is that this inference is not a matter of some kind of subjectivity. It's not arbitrary. It's very clear, and it really has a crystalline logic. The one thing I want to press on you is the degree to which literature really has a logic. It wants to appeal to your heart, but really the great works of literature are written with a lot of subtle logic to them, kind of a logical edifice that has connected them together in this way. Okay, so we are rounding third and heading for home now in this lecture, and I just want to finish talking about some important distinction between literal and figurative. But let's conclude with this issue of inferences. This is very important. The speaker or writer implies, and the listener or reader infers from what has been implied. What does it mean to imply? It means to suggest. It means to hint. It means to intimate. To nudge someone without spelling it out, because it's so crass and it's so beneath sophisticated people to have to spell everything out. Right? If Winston Churchill said, "But you're going to be ugly forever," the joke wouldn't have worked, because it would have been actually cruel and just kind of vulgar, right? But when he says it in the way he says it, he does it with the least amount of explicit statement of kind of cruelty, which allows it to be funny. So the speaker implies, and that's what Churchill has done, and then the listener infers, which is they make a logical deduction from the suggestion that's been given to them, right? And this is how all speech works. So now I want to address what is the theme here. It's both what is interpretation and why is it needed, right? So one thing we come upon with the works of literature that we're dealing with, and it's true of almost all literature, great works of literature, is that they function in the realm of the figurative more than the literal. So this raises the question between the distinction between literal speech and figurative speech, and they are opposites or antonyms. Let's just kind of sum them up in a nutshell. Literal speech is speech that is basically can be taken at face value. It is what it is. It means what it is. It doesn't mean something other than what it means. Figurative speech, by definition, means something other than what's being literally said. We're going to read later on Plato's allegory of the cave. The word allegory, an allegory, is literally a story that means something other than what it purports to be on the surface. It's telling a meaning or giving a meaning in another way that actually is not. So, for example, Aesop's Fables, right? A story about a country mouse and a city mouse is not really a story about two mice. It's actually about human beings, right? And that one needs to discern that to understand what's going on. One of the great challenges for us, why did I give you this trajectory of authoritative accounts through history? And that we live in the age, the kind of epoch of the dominance of modern natural science and its emphasis on the material world, a very specific object that they claim exists, the material world, right? And that everything be reduced to quantity, and that poetry gets really stripped from the world, right? We live in an age of the literal. We are not good interpreters of figurative speech because it is not the kind of paradigm or the worldview through which we function and operate. We function much more through literal speech that is more self-evident, right? And particularly the forms of speech that we tend to be conversant with, whether it's spoken or written, tend to, by their very nature, to be more literal. So the texts we're going to be reading are going to be more figurative, and we'll talk about that distinction now. So literal speech literally means the letter of what is said, and literal, it's the root word from literature, letters or words. The letter of the law, for example. When you follow the letter of the law, you follow it literally. You follow it exactly as written. You don't follow the spirit or your feeling about what those words mean. You follow them strictly and accurately without any kind of addition to them. So literal speech has to do with the strict letter of what is said, and what is meant is the same as what is said. We see how meaning and what's said are actually two different things, almost always. It speaks directly to you. It speaks, this is important, it has a certain style to literal speech. It's precise, and it's not in need of a tremendous amount of interpretation. It is what it is. It's nothing else and no more. And this is important. Literal speech tends to be more rooted, almost always, in empirical facts, and doesn't raise more elusive things that are kind of wishy-washy ideas that can't be tied down into clear empirical realities. So, for example, if you read the front page of the newspaper, journalism is very rooted in the depiction, the portrayal of empirical facts. This is what happened today at 5:30. John Doe got shot on the street corner, and he was walking east on, York Street or what have you, right? Literal speech tends to deal with the actual and empirical. What do I mean by empirical or empirical information, empirical fact? I mean that information that comes to us through our senses, right? Science is empirical because it only deals with data that comes through our senses. Science isn't going to accept Moses. Science is not going to accept the information that Moses got when he went up on Mount Sinai and communed with God. Why? Because science only deals with the empirical realm and evidence that comes through the senses. And this main line to God that the prophet Moses had is not considered an acceptable means of gaining information or knowledge about the world. For them, it's not knowledge about the world at all, right? So figurative speech speaks in contrast indirectly, right? And it's in need of interpretation. It speaks in parables, in allegories, right? Irony, we've talked about it. It needs interpretation because it means literally the opposite of what is said. Figurative speech steps in to describe those realities that are not simply captured by descriptions of sense experience or the senses. It's hot, it's cold, right? Joe Biden gave a speech the other week. He talked about darkness and light. Well, guess what? He wasn't talking about I'm in a dark room or in a light side. He was talking about some psychological reality or moral reality connected with good and evil, right? And of course, when God creates light, it's almost always interpreted by scholars and theologians as to mean not just physical illumination, but it's a spiritual light, it's the light of the truth, it's the light of reason, it's the light of goodness. All these different elusive meanings are wrapped up in that word, making it less literal and more figurative. Figurative speech attempts to articulate mental and emotional and spiritual realities which seem to be at the limits of the physical and of language. It uses the same literal language but redeploys it in order to give it a new meaning. I have to imagine in the development of human speech that the first words we had all referred to very concrete and physical realities, and that as speech got more sophisticated in its use, that it started to be redeployed to describe immaterial realities. And this is one thing. Figurative speech takes words that describe the physical and material world and are used to describe immaterial realities. And there is a great analysis of this actually by a famous philosopher by the name of Gilbert Ryle in The Concept of Mind. And he said the very idea of the mind is a bit of metaphorical or figurative speech, because we all know that the mind is just the brain, but the mind in a sense is what the brain does, and it's slightly more elusive than just that physical thing between your ears. And what the mind does is also rather elusive. He says we use the word we see with our minds, like you say to someone, I see it, but you don't really see it because you don't see anything, because what you're seeing is an idea, and what you really mean is like, I get it. And even think of that when you say, I get it. You're not physically getting anything. You're understanding the meaning of something. We feel with our emotions. We feel with our hearts. If you think about strictly speaking, we take these words in a literal sense. Literally, to feel means to touch something and to sense it, with our bodies, right? We grasp a bit of information. What is grasp? Grasp means this. So what is our mind doing? It's grasping the information. When we understand something, we get it. You can see all these phrases. If you look at them from their most literal meanings, you realize that they're all being used figuratively here. But you're so used to these expressions, you don't even think about the way in which they're actually figurative to begin with. Okay, so what does figurative speech do? And this is why it makes it challenging for us to interpret it. Figurative speech repurposes the meaning of literal speech. Figurative speech redeploys and recontextualizes words and takes common words and phrases and gives them a new meaning, right? Often figurative language is designed to make tangible those entities that are intangible, invisible, or immaterial. Ideas and concepts are often things that start with concrete reference, which are repurposed to express abstractions or relations between things. So let me give you some examples of entities that don't have simple, tangible existences, but we all are kind of convinced that they really exist, with some disagreements. And we talk about them all the time, and we have to use some type of metaphorical or figurative speech to make sense of them. Talk about the mind, the soul, talk about something like love, right? It's like you see two people interacting for 50 years. What makes that love? What is it in their interaction that you saw comes under the rubric of this concept love? God, our feelings, all these things are rather elusive, right? Rousseau wrote The Confessions, which was an autobiography. It's very interesting. He said, I am not writing the autobiography of my external life. And what he meant was the physical facts of my life. I was born, I moved here, I lived there, I did this job, I did that. He wanted to write an autobiography of his inner life. And he says the great problem with that is my inner life is my own first-hand experience that words can't fully capture because, well, you're not me, right? How can he attempt to transmit that information? And he said, if I'm truly, this is what he thought of it, if I'm truly going to succeed in attempting to portray my inner life, I'm going to need to invent a language. I'm going to need to invent a language. And of course he can't do that, because if he does that, we don't know what he's talking about. So he's French or French-speaking Swiss, so he's got to write in French, and he's got to deploy old words and give them the meanings that capture his inner life, and that's not an easy thing. So when we think of figurative speech, the dominant form of figurative speech we all tend to think about is a metaphor. So the metaphor is the kind of standard bearer of almost all types of figurative speech. Almost all types of figurative speech, in one way or another, can be traced back to being some version of a metaphor, right? And we all know the difference between a metaphor and a simile. A metaphor is a comparison of two unlike things without using like or as. The simile uses like or as. The simile is just a really claptrap example. The clouds were like cotton. And when you say we're like cotton, the ground of meaning and understanding is really clear. But when the author tells you the character looked up, John looked up and he saw clouds of cotton, right? As opposed to clouds that look like cotton. All of a sudden you're like, what world are we in here? Clouds of cotton? Right? It's ambiguous. In the Odyssey, days pass and they depict nighttime and people going to sleep and then them waking up. And at dawn, Homer has this expression that's repeated throughout the Odyssey. Rosy-fingered dawn. Rosy-fingered dawn. Well, dawn doesn't have any fingers. The sun doesn't have any literal fingers. And how are we to make of that? So metaphors are particularly confusing. But this definition of a metaphor, a comparison between two unlike things, not without using like or as, is not really a full, that's like what you hear in high school, but it's not really the full understanding of what a metaphor is. A metaphor is a substitution of one thing for another, where the properties and qualities of one thing are transposed and transferred onto another in order to illuminate or clarify or provide a new facet of their meaning, provide a new understanding of the original thing. So when I say the clouds are cotton, right? Oh, it sounds so literary. Oh, so literary, right? And some of you are like, I can't stand poetry. It's a bunch of gobbledygook. But something very logical is actually happening there. They're transferring the characteristics of cotton that we're all familiar with, those literal properties, those empirical properties. It's fluffy, it's white, it's airy, and transferring those properties onto the clouds, right? So if we take for the example Rosy-fingered dawn, what's being talked about in the Odyssey. Dawn and her rose fingers. So first we see that Dawn is being personified as a her. And then we realize, what are the fingers? Well, the first thing you have to do to see that this metaphor is very rational and makes sense, it's not just artsy-fartsy, right, is that you imagine what dawn actually looks like in the real world, in real life. And it has rays of sun, and they're not bright pale yellow like at 12 o'clock noon, right? They're pinky rosy color because when the sun comes up and goes down, it has these wonderful kind of transmutation of colors because of the angle that the light is coming through the atmosphere that makes it, it creates a spectral range of colors, right? And that the fingers are just the rays of light out on the Mediterranean where Odysseus, our character, is, right? So metaphor, meta means beyond, and phore means to bear meaning or to transfer meaning. So you take the meaning beyond, which means you take the meaning of the clouds and you take it beyond itself and you transfer it to another thing. So when I wake up, your face is a shining sun. So notice when it says your face was like a shining sun, I still might not know what that means. But when your face is a shining sun, you're happy to see them. It's, you know, a welcoming face to start the new day, because who likes to wake up? Everybody's in a grumpy mood, right? So you can see that there's a very clear rationale for most people. I think this metaphor. It's not a great metaphor, but it's clear, right? In that, I think for most people, but not everybody, waking up to the sun is kind of a pleasing experience as opposed to waking up to a rainy day. It's welcoming, it's inviting, it's warm in the emotional sense, in the literal sense, but also the emotional sense. So once you start thinking about this metaphor and trying to interpret it, you realize that there's a lot of basic logic going on here, and that it's not just some kind of arbitrary poetic flourish, right? Okay. So now we've talked about interpretation and what's involved in it, and particularly why interpretation. Because for various reasons, meanings do not, I should say, challenging works of literature do not easily yield up their meanings, right? And it's particularly because they're written to be opaque to some degree, and particularly because they're written with the use of not literal language, but figurative language. And figurative language, by definition, demands that it be interpreted, right? In the next lecture, we'll look at the mechanics specifically of reading itself. Thank you.